Okay, this is video lecture number 43. Today we will be examining war, expansion, and slavery. We have 4 sections that we are covering today. The first is the war with Mexico from 1846 to 48, then a divisive victory, California gold and racial warfare, and finally 1850 crisis and compromise. So following his victory in the election of 1844, James K. Polk pursued an aggressively expansionist policy. To the northwest, he ended joint American-British control of the Oregon Territory, though he agreed to dividing control along the 49th parallel rather than insisting on seizing the entire territory south of the 5440 or fight line. Polk proved far more aggressive in the Southwest against a weaker opponent, Mexico. Taking advantage of the popular outcry over the defeat of the Texas rebels at the Alamo, Polk got Congress to declare war in May of 1846. The war proved both popular, despite significant opposition from Whigs, and successful, resulting not only in the annexation of an enlarged Texas, but also the seizure of California and New Mexico. However, Polk's very success in pursuing the United States' manifest destiny immediately sharpened intersectional conflict over slavery. Mexico had abolished slavery, and many Northerners were averse to seeing American power used to extend the peculiar institution to regions where freedom had already been established. Many other white Northerners, feeling the western lands should be reserved for white small farmers, not great planters and blacks, were beginning to adhere to a new form of anti-slavery, which was called the Free Soil movement. If it was morally inferior to humanitarian anti-slavery, Free Soil was politically much more potent. One of its leaders, Representative David Wilmot, proposed a popular measure to bar slavery from the Mexican territories. The 1846 Wilmot Proviso quickly became a flashpoint for North-South conflict, but it was soon joined by other issues, including a free state movement in California and increasing Northern resistance to enforcement of the constitutional requirement that fugitive slaves be returned to their masters. Anti-slavery spokesmen warned that to give in to what they saw as Southern bullying would extend the sway in federal affairs of what they called the slave power, a Southern interest hostile not simply to abolitionists, but to the rights of white Northerners as well. The Southern response was that, short of secession, which remained a right of last resort, the only remedy for the increasingly polarized situation was constitutional reform. All right, war, expansion, and slavery, 1846 to 1850, starting with a closer look at the war with Mexico. President Polk saw Texas as just the beginning. He wanted American control over all Mexican territory between Texas and the Pacific Ocean and was prepared to go to war to get it. Mexico was determined to retain its territories, of course, and when the Texas Republic accepted American statehood in 1845, Mexico broke off diplomatic relations with the United States. To intimidate the Mexican government, Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to occupy the disputed lands between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. Polk sent a man named John Slidell to Mexico City, then on a secret diplomatic initiative to secure Mexican acceptance of the Rio Grande boundary and to buy Mexico and California. Mexican officials refused to see him. Polk's alternative plan was to foment a revolution in California that, as in Texas, would lead to an independent republic and a subsequent request for annexation. In October of 1845, at Polk's request, Thomas O. Larkin encouraged the leading Mexican residents of Monterey, California, to declare their independence and support peaceful annexation. Polk also ordered naval commanders to seize California's coastal towns in case of war, and dispatched Captain John C. Fremont's heavily armed troops deep into Mexican territory. Hoping to incite an armed Mexican response, Polk ordered General Taylor to the Rio Grande. When a clash occurred, Polk blamed the Mexicans for the bloodshed and called for war. Now, ignoring Whig pleas for a negotiated settlement, the Democratic majority in Congress voted in favor of going to war with Mexico. Now, to avoid simultaneous war with Britain, the president accepted a British proposal to divide the Oregon country at the 49th parallel. By the end of 1846, the United States controlled much of northeastern Mexico, and American forces secured control of California by 1847. Santa Anna went on the offensive, attacking Zachary Taylor's units at Buena Vista in 1847, and only superior artillery enabled a narrow American victory. General Winfield Scott's troops then seized Mexico City in September of 1847. Santa Anna was overthrown, and the new Mexican government agreed to make peace. So, our next section is entitled A Divisive Victory. Conscience Whigs viewed the Mexican War as a conspiracy to add new slave states in the West, and Polk's expansionist policy split the Democrats into sectional factions. The Wilmot Proviso of 1846 was intended to prohibit slavery in any new territories acquired from Mexico. The Senate killed the proviso. To reunite the Democrats then, before the election, Polk and Buchanan abandoned their expansionist hopes for Mexico and agreed to take only California and New Mexico. In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, the United States agreed to pay Mexico $15 million for Texas, north of the Rio Grande, New Mexico, and California. Many Northerners then joined a new free soil movement, viewing slavery as a threat to republicanism and the yeoman farmers, and not, as the Liberty Party believed, a sin against the natural rights of African Americans. This was more of an economic thing for these people. The Wilmot Proviso's call for free soil was the first anti-slavery proposal to attract broad popular support. Frederick Douglass, the foremost black abolitionist, endorsed the free soil movement and began to lecture for William Lloyd Garrison's American Anti-Slavery Society. Democrats nominated Lewis Cass as their presidential candidate for the election of 1848. Cass was an avid expansionist who proposed squatter sovereignty and was deliberately vague on the issue of slavery in the West. The Free Soilers nominated Martin Van Buren for president. The Whigs nominated General Zachary Taylor, a slave owner who had not taken a public position on slavery in the territories. Taylor and his running mate, Millard Fillmore, won the election. But the electoral margin was thin because of the free soil ticket taking New York's vote. All right, let's go to California then. Let's look at California gold and racial warfare. Even before Taylor took office, workers for John A. Sutter in the Sierra Nevada foothills of California discovered little flakes of gold in January of 1848. By January of 1849, 61 crowded ships had left northeastern ports to sail around Cape Horn to San Francisco. By May of that year, 12,000 wagons had crossed the Missouri River, bound for the California goldfields. By the end of 1849, more than 80,000 people, mostly men, had arrived in California. Most of these miners eventually found themselves working for wages for companies that engaged in hydraulic or underground mining. Many others turned to farming. Farming required arable land, which was owned by Mexican grantees or occupied by Indian peoples. Now, the subjugation of the Indians came first. In 1848, there were about 150,000 Indians in California. By 1861, there were only 30,000. European diseases, again, took the lives of thousands of natives, but in California, white settlers also undertook systematic campaigns of extermination, and local political leaders did little to stop them. Congress abetted these assaults. At the bidding of white Californians, it repudiated treaties that federal agents had negotiated with 119 tribes, and that provided the Indians with 7 million acres of land. In 1853, Congress authorized 5 reservations of only 25,000 acres each and refused to provide the Indians with military protection. Some settlers simply murdered Indians to push them off non-reservation lands. Other white Californians turned to slave trading. Now, the Mexicans and Californios who held grants to thousands of acres were harder to dislodge. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo guaranteed that the land grants made by Spanish and Mexican authorities would be inviolably respected. Despite the fact that many of the 800 grants in California were either fraudulent or questionable, the Land Claims Commission created by Congress upheld the validity of 75% of them. In the meantime, hundreds of Americans had set up farms on the grants, many of which had never been settled. American squatters, as we call these people, rejected the notion that so much unoccupied and unimproved land could be held by just a few families. They successfully pressured local land commissioners and also judges to void these suspect grants. In Northern California, farmers found that they could grow most eastern crops. Ranchers gradually replaced Spanish cattle with American breeds, and they found a ready market as California's population shot up to 380,000 by 1860 and 560,000 by 1870. Wheat and barley farmers cultivated hundreds of acres using the latest technology and scores of hired workers to produce huge crops, which San Francisco merchants then exported to Europe at very high prices. The gold rush gradually turned into a wheat boom. Okay, our last section is 1850, Crisis and Compromise. The gold rush and subsequent influx of settlers revived the national debate over free soil. In November of 1849, Californians ratified a state constitution that prohibited slavery. The admission of California as a state threatened the carefully maintained balance of slave states versus non-slave states in the Senate. Southern leaders decided to block California's entry unless the federal government guaranteed the future of slavery. John C. Calhoun warned of possible secession by slave states and advanced the doctrine that Congress had no constitutional authority at all to regulate slavery in these new territories. Many Southerners and some Northern Democrats were willing to extend the Missouri Compromise line all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. And what would happen then would be slave owners would have some guaranteed land in the Western Territory. A third choice existed, squatter or popular sovereignty. Placed decisions about slavery in the hands of local settlers and their territorial governments. Now, anti-slavery advocates were unwilling to accept any plan for California that might involve the expansion of slavery in the territories, and they also urged federal authorities to restrict slavery within its existing boundaries and then ultimately extinguish it completely. Whigs and Democrats desperately sought a compromise to preserve the Union. Whigs then organized the Compromise of 1850. The compromise included a Fugitive Slave Act, and that mollified the South. It admitted California as a free state and abolished the slave trade in Washington, D.C. That mollified the North. And it organized the rest of the lands acquired from Mexico into the territories of New Mexico and Utah on the basis of popular sovereignty. The compromise averted a secession crisis in 1850, but resulted in special conventions in the South. In exchange for the support of the compromise, moderate Southern politicians agreed to support secession in the future if Congress abolished slavery anywhere or refused to grant statehood to a territory with a pro-slavery constitution. Okay, so this does conclude today's video lecture. At this time, please answer the review questions and continue on with your work.